Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. We very much appreciate your interest in this webinar, during which we'll be looking more closely at how high school graduation rates are calculated and the implications of the parameters used for English learner students. I'm Margie McHugh, Director of the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. But before we get started, I want to cover a few quick housekeeping details that'll be familiar to those of you who've joined us in the past. We will be uploading the slides and audio from today's webinar to the MPI website. You can see the web address there on the screen. If you have any problems accessing the webinar, please email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or call us at 202-266-1929. We've got steady coverage of both the email account and the phone number if there are any difficulties that we can help you with. Please, as you know, we love it when you use the Q&A chat function on the right of the screen during the webinar to write questions. That helps us sort of combine questions that are sort of in the same area, figure out to which of the speakers we're going to pitch them to and the like. So very helpful to get those during the webinar. And you can also send an email to events@migrationpolicy.org or tweet questions to @migrationpolicy #MPI discuss. So as you know, I think from signing up for the webinar, we're delighted both to be releasing a new report today authored by Julie Sugarman, Senior Policy Analyst here at MPI for pre-K to 12 education. And I'll be introducing both Julie and Russell Rumberger, who's a professor emeritus at the UC Santa Barbara Perverse Graduate School of Education, and also for many years director of the California Dropout Research Project, both of whom will be sharing some of their research and thoughts around the various issues that all are sort of entwined in this kind of ongoing issue for, I would say, several decades now, about how to figure out how to set proper parameters for accountability using high school graduation rates. Just quickly, I'll tee this up by saying that MPI's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy has had very long-standing interest since our founding in 2007 in education pipeline issues. We've got a variety of investments looking in early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, adult ed, and workforce development issues. And of course, it's that body of work that this report comes from. I should also say a little bit more specifically that in response to the surge in unaccompanied children arriving through the U.S. southern border back in 2013 to 2015, and our center created a learning network for newcomer youth success that involved representatives of about 40 school districts that were heavily impacted by what we refer to as late arriving youth, meaning youth who were ages 12 to 21. And school district representatives that were part of that network got together mainly to share some of the issues they were facing and trying to deal with providing effective instruction to those students. And one of the very difficult issues to come out of that was the pressure that those districts often felt they were under related to performance accountability and their graduation rates. Sort of, I guess I would say very kind of roughly, the idea that we've set up performance accountability in most cases for students that we assume school districts have spent about 12 years working with, and yet we have students arriving facing those performance requirements that may have gaps in their education and are English learners and very often would only spend a few years in those districts. And so that's where today's report release comes from. I think our communications team still winces a little at this title, The Unintended Consequences for English Learners from Using the 4-Year Graduation Rate for School Accountability. At least it says what the report is really about. But so we're delighted to have this finally out there for the public, because it's been an issue that we've wanted to talk about, and Julie in particular has wanted to talk about for a number of years, just to try and make more visible for folks who are both in the immigrant and refugee policy world as well as in the K-12 world, what the the intersectionality is here for, in particular, I would say, late arriving newcomers. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie in a moment. I'll just say that also from that Learning Network on Newcomer Youth Success, if you're interested in that body of work, Julie also published a report called Beyond Teaching English that looked at a lot of the practices that those different school districts were using to try and work more effectively with late arriving youth. Julie came to us about 4 years ago now from the Center for Applied Linguistics, where she specialized in evaluating educational programs for English learners and in particular on dual language and two-way immersion programs. So Julie, congratulations on today's report release, and happy to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Margie. I'm really, as Margie said, I'm really excited about bringing this information to light, and I think it's really sort of the opening of a conversation with schools and with policymakers about how we're doing accountability. So arguably the most important innovation of the federal accountability system that began with No Child Left Behind is the requirement for every school to account for achievement gaps between traditionally successful and traditionally underserved student subgroups. The idea was that no group should be held to lower standards, whether racial ethnic minorities or students from low-income families or English learners. And that's never more true than for high school graduation rates, since that milestone is so critical to individuals and communities. But something that's been brought to light over the last 20 years is that the English learner subgroup isn't like other subgroups, because by definition, high-achieving students are continually exiting the designation, and students with low English skills are continually joining it. That revolving pattern becomes more obvious at high school, by which time large shares of students who used to be Ls have exited the status. High school Ls generally fall into 4 categories: newcomer students with interrupted formal education, newcomer students at or close to grade level, progressing Ls who arrived in late elementary or middle school and are on track to exit EL status within the typical 4 to 7 year time frame, and long-term English learners who've been identified as ELs for 7 or more years. This presentation asks whether we ought to reconsider whether a one-size-fits-all definition of a high school graduate shortchanges Ls. We also want to consider whether the mere fact of having a high-stakes 4-year graduation rate creates undue pressure on schools to worry about how English learners affects their accountability ratings, especially with regard to newcomers with interrupted formal education, who often require additional time to develop academic proficiency in English and to complete the full range of courses required to get a high school diploma. In our second presentation today, Russ Rumberger is going to speak to you about different ways that we can measure the number of high school graduates, but I'm just going to talk today about one specific calculation called the adjusted cohort graduation rate. Prior to 2010, states were all using different methods to calculate their high school graduation rate, which meant that you couldn't really compare them. So based on a recommendation from a National Governors Association task force, all of the states decided to use a uniform method. As soon as students enter 9th grade for the first time, they're assigned to a cohort, and the ACGR measures how many of the students in that cohort graduate a certain number of years later. For example, the 4-year ACGR for the class of 2018 is the number of graduates in 2018 divided by the number of first-time 9th graders in 2014-15, which is to say the original cohort, to which we add students who transfer into that high school and subtract students who transfer out. Now, the number of transfers out is important because this is where we capture dropouts. Under federal regulations, the only students who can be counted as transfers out of the cohort are students who transfer to a program leading to a regular diploma, who emigrate, or who die. All other students, including those who switch to a GED program or who are still in high school after 4 years, are considered non-graduates for the purposes of the 4-year ACGR. So all of the states report their 4-year ACGRs to the federal government, and the Department of Education adds all of the data together to look at national trends. On this chart, you can see on the top line that about 85% of all students in the class of 2017 graduated on time. Just below that is the English learner rate, which is 66%, and rates for other student subgroups are below that. Graduation rates have risen about 5% since states started using the ACGR in 2010-11, and all of the student subgroups have closed the achievement gap with the national average by a couple of percent. But as you can see, there are still some substantial differences. The graduation rate is important not just for its own sake, but because it's one of the measures used in state accountability systems. The Every Student Succeeds Act laid out a number of indicators that all states have to use to track the performance of public schools. Those include academic achievement, which is measured by annual standardized tests of English language arts and math, the progress that English learners make in attaining English language proficiency, an indicator of school quality or student success, such as average attendance rates, and then elementary and middle schools have an additional measure of academic progress, and high schools report their graduation rates. The graduation rate indicator has to include the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate, which means the number of students that graduated on time. But states can also choose to use extended year grad rates in that indicator, which gives schools credit for students who graduate in 5, 6, or 7 years. Unlike in No Child Left Behind, under ESSA, states have had some flexibility for the consequences schools face if they fail to meet accountability benchmarks. But states still have some common guidelines on how they should go about identifying the schools that have the lowest outcomes. This includes identifying schools for what's called Comprehensive Support and Improvement, or CSI. There are 3 ways to fall into this category. One is being among the lowest 5% of schools that receive federal Title I funding, and this is based on a calculation that takes into account all of the indicators I showed you on that last slide. The second way is being a high school that has a graduation rate less than 67%. The third way we're not going to deal with today, but it has to do with failing with subgroups over time. And I know that the details here are getting a little wonky, but what's important is that identifying schools as either the lowest 5% or as high schools with low graduation rates are a major piece of what gives the accountability system teeth. And while states have to use the 4-year graduation rate in both of those, they can also choose to include the extended year graduation rates in the way they make those calculations. So as it turns out, the 21 states on this map that are shaded in light teal use extended year graduation rates for identifying the lowest 5% of Title I schools, and 9 additional states do that and also use extended year rates for identifying high schools with low graduation rates, and those are the ones shaded in darker teal. Along with 4 states that use extended year graduation rates to some extent, what this means is that there's 16 states plus the District of Columbia that don't include extended year graduation rates in this critical piece of their accountability system. Together, those states enroll 60% of the country's ELs. And now I'm going to show you why I think using only the 4-year rate is a particular problem for English learners. You can see here some of the data from states that report a 5 or a 5 and 6 year graduation rate for the class of 2015. Each state's 4-year graduation rate is shown in light blue, and then the light teal adds the share of students that graduated in 5 years. And in some states, a dark teal bar shows the share of students graduating in 6 years. And you have the rates for English learners on top and the rates for all students beneath it for each of the states that I'm showing here. There's more states in the report, but I just wanted you to be able to see the illustration clearly. What this figure shows is that in almost every state, the share of English learners who graduates in additional time is quite a bit bigger than the share of all students who graduate in additional time. And in some cases, like Colorado and Michigan, the English learner 5-year rate almost catches up to the all students 4-year rate. This is another way to look at the same data, and this is for all of the states that reported 5-year graduation rates for the class of 2015, which is to say kids that graduated in 2016. This graph shows the rates for 5 subgroups of students: English learners, students with disabilities, economically disadvantaged students, which is to say students that qualify for free or reduced price lunch, white students, and Black students. So, for example, in Texas, about 6% of English learners from the original cohort graduated in 5 years, as did 4% of students with disabilities, 3% each of economically disadvantaged and Black students, and about 1% of white students. And what's really interesting in this figure is that in most of the states, English learners have more 5-year graduates than the other groups. If you look way to the right, in Oregon, Colorado, Maryland, and Nebraska, 10% or more of the English learner cohort graduated in 5 years, which is pretty significant. So if nothing else, and we'll talk about what that something else is in a second, these figures show that in some states, like these 4 that report their extended year graduation rate but don't use it in accountability, schools aren't getting credit for the kids that graduate in additional years, and large numbers of those students are English learners. Although the research report we're releasing today argues for more nuance in the way we measure high school graduation rates, it's important to remember that the federal accountability system was designed to respond to persistent achievement gaps. The idea was that transparent reporting of such gaps would show policymakers and educators where to direct needed resources. So applying one graduation rate to all students was a way of signaling that all students should be held to high standards. But with any policy innovation that comes with high stakes, we need to be aware of the unintended consequences. One issue is that any time you attach financial or professional consequences to a high-stakes measurement, you're going to get folks who game the system. There's no telling how widespread actual fraud has been, but there have been a number of media stories reporting high schools improperly removing students from their graduation cohorts without evidence they moved to a program leading to a regular degree, and this has the effect of inflating their graduation rate. Another problem that's been reported in the last few years has been some high schools turning away immigrant and refugee newcomers who arrive in the U.S. in their upper teenage years. In many of these cases, administrators have directed these students to adult education or alternative high schools instead of allowing them to enroll in comprehensive high schools. While those programs, the alternative programs or adult ed, can be a good choice for some young people, many of them are not designed to help students develop academic English and earn credits towards a regular high school diploma. Advocates have alleged that administrators in these cases have discouraged students from enrolling in their high schools out of fear that the students won't be able to earn enough credits to graduate in 4 years or before they age out of the public school system, which in most states happens at 20 or 21. While this is clearly unethical, it's also straightforward to see how it could happen, since many administrators fear job loss or public shame as a consequence of their school failing to meet state benchmarks. In such a system, you can see how some administrators might view a 16-year-old immigrant with no transferable high school credits as a potential liability. Another issue is whether schools feel pressured to accelerate the high school course of study for newcomers in ways they might not if the 4-year graduation rate weren't so high stakes. Many newcomer high school programs have traditionally provided intensive English language development and instruction in basic skills for students with interrupted formal education to catch up on what they need to be successful in mainstream high school classes. But many times those types of classes don't count for credits needed to graduate, and so taking a year's worth of such courses can automatically put a student on a 5 or 6 year path to graduation. Now, there is research evidence that integrating language education with grade level content is beneficial for ELs at all levels, and that many ELs have been unnecessarily held back from credit-bearing academic courses. But we really don't know how much academic acceleration and integration into the mainstream is too much for whom and in what contexts. Many schools have been redesigning their programs for newcomers to accelerate their access to credit-bearing courses and to push them to graduate in 4 years, but we don't really know what the consequences of this are. For example, are students with very low levels of English getting enough language support in mainstream classes? And are they getting as much out of those classes as they would if they had an additional semester or year of English development? This is a delicate question because we know that approaches that require students to reach a predetermined English language proficiency level before they can take content courses are ineffective in the long run. But the shift we see in the field towards more acceleration and more integration into the mainstream should be based on good research on language acquisition and pedagogy, and it would be concerning if it were only implemented to meet the demands of state accountability systems. Before the next reauthorization of the Every Student Succeeds Act, we should consider whether there's a better way to identify schools that are truly underserving their students while making reasonable accommodations to prevent undue penalties on schools that serve students with more complex learning needs. Margie?
Great. Thanks very much, Julie. You have set the table with these issues and with the data. And now I'm just so honored and pleased to be able to introduce Russ Rumberger. As I said early, he's a professor emeritus at the UC Santa Barbara Graduate School of Education, and he's one of the country's leading thinkers and doers, I think it's fair to say, on dropout and graduation rate issues, having devoted a very significant portion of his career to those issues. We're really delighted that he was able to join us for this webinar to share some of his research and perspective with us. For any of you who are coming from the immigrant and refugee world and who may not be aware of the depth of his work, he published a seminal book in 2011 titled Dropping Out: Why Students Drop Out of High School and What Can Be Done About It. And then very recently, just at the end of this past year, 2018, published a report, What is California's High School Graduation Rate, which we thought was incredibly pertinent to today's conversation, given that he has spent so many years as the director of the California Dropout Project, and really the work goes very deeply into a lot of the different policy recommendations for how to move forward in trying to address some of the issues that are the focus of today's conversation. So Russ, thank you again for joining us, and we're really looking forward to hearing some of your perspective from your research and also all the years you've spent trying to shape policy around these issues.
Thanks, Margie, and you too, Julie. I'm pleased to be a part of this webinar, and in my very short time, I'm just going to talk about some different ways of thinking and measuring high school graduation rates based on that policy brief that you mentioned, Margie, that came out last year, published by the PACE group in California. So, as Julie mentioned, high school graduation rates are one of the most important indicators of educational performance, not only because of ESSA, but in many state accountability systems. And seemingly, it would seem like straightforward that there would be a way to define it that's pretty clear and simple. But in fact, there's actually different ways of calculating high school graduation rates, and really depends on several things, including the purpose of the rate, the population that's being studied, the data that are used, and the definition of graduation. And based on a review of these different factors and different rates, I've concluded that each method has a series of strengths and weaknesses. And moreover, no single rate is sufficient to adequately determine the status of high school graduation. So I'm just going to talk very briefly this morning about some of these issues and some of these different rates. So as I mentioned, there's really several different factors that you have to consider in deciding what kind of rate and what specific rate you might want to compute. And one of the considerations is what's the purpose of the rate that you want to use. And there's two major purposes that I was able to identify. One is measuring the well-being or status of a population. We typically think of that in terms of educational attainment, and one of those indicators is high school graduation. And the other one is serving as an indicator of school performance and educational accountability. That's what Julie was talking about earlier. But there are these two different purposes, and they do dictate in part what kind of rate you might want to compute. The second and third considerations are the population and the data that you use to compute them. So if we're talking about a status rate, typically we're thinking about some kind of age population. For example, the working age adults 25 to 64 years old, or youth ages 16 to 24. And many of these population indicators or in population-based rates are based on census data, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. You know, the second purpose is where we're talking about using as a measure of school performance or accountability. And then we're typically talking about some kind of grade cohort, as Julie mentioned, and the most common being, of course, entering ninth grade students. That's when students typically start high school. And we like to know what proportion of those finish within some amount of time. These rates are typically based on some kind of state data systems, but they also can be based on specifically designed longitudinal studies that the federal government has undertaken over these years. And then the last factor really is what counts as graduation, which is in and of itself a pretty big thing. So in other words, what do you mean by somebody graduating from high school? What counts as a diploma? And there's been some discussion about that, but what makes it complicated is the fact that states and local school districts can set their own requirements for high school graduation, and therefore there can be a lot of variability across districts and across states. And they can also vary over time. Additionally, some states and districts provide alternative pathways to earn a diploma. So as a result of this, as Julie pointed out, the federal government came up with this kind of standard definition that everybody's supposed to use under ESSA at least, and it's technically the standard, this is a quote from the federal government, the standard high school diploma awarded to the preponderance of students in a state that's fully aligned with the state standards and does not include a general equivalency diploma, certificate of completion, certificate of attendance, or any similar or lesser credential such as a diploma based on meeting individual education goals. So one of the things that this does is it excludes, for example, diplomas earned in adult schools, even if those diplomas earned in adult schools are in fact meet the state standards in that state. So my co-author and I, when we wrote this report, decided that graduation rates should be seen as, quote, a moving target. And that makes it difficult to render meaningful comparisons between states and districts or over time because of these various definitions that are used. So now let me talk a little bit about some specific graduation rates, both some that are currently used and some that we would argue should be considered to be used. And one basic distinction between these different rates is whether it's a status rate, which is done at a single point in time, or a longitudinal rate that's done over time. So the first and the most common one historically is a status graduation rate called the status completion rate. And it's calculated and reported by the U.S. Bureau of the Census. And it serves this first policy goal of trying to get some sense about what the educational attainment levels are of a population. It's based on data from the current population survey and more recently the American Community Survey. So this particular indicator represents the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds who are not enrolled in school and who hold a high school diploma or an alternative credential. So again, it's referred to as a status rate because it's calculated at one point in time. So the major advantage of this particular rate is it can be calculated for very small geographic areas due to the widespread coverage and frequency of data collected by the census. So you'll often see these kind of rates calculated and reported for cities and counties and even small geographic areas like neighborhoods. The disadvantage is that it doesn't distinguish between regular high school graduates and alternative high school graduates, or what they call completers. So the former successfully earn a traditional high school diploma, while the latter may earn a traditional diploma or a high school equivalency certificate, typically by passing one of several equivalency tests, such as the General Educational Development or GED exam. So this distinction is important because research finds that GED-based diploma holders do not enjoy the same benefits as graduates with diplomas. As a result, the census graduation rate estimates are biased upward because they're based on completion rather than graduation rates. And you can see that here in Figure 1, the top dotted line being the status completion rates and the bottom ones being these cohort rates that I'm going to talk about in a minute. You can see there's a fairly sizable gap between the two. The second kind of rates, as I mentioned, are cohort rates, and there's actually two different cohort rates that are currently being used. One of them is called the average freshman graduation rate, which represents an estimated percentage of high school students who graduate with a regular diploma 4 years after starting the ninth grade. So this indicator is computed by the U.S. Department of Education using Common Core data and is reported by the states. So one advantage of this AFGR rate is that it represents a cohort longitudinal graduate rate measured over a 4-year period. So it does kind of capture this idea of wanting to know how many ninth graders graduate on time or within 4 years. Another advantage is that's because it's based on collected aggregate student enrollment, it can be calculated far back into the past. So whereas the ACGR that I'm going to talk about in a minute, as Julie pointed out, has only been around 10 years, a little less than 10 years, we can compute this rate historically. So that said, the one disadvantage of the AFGR is that it's not a true cohort rate because the numerator and denominator are not based on the same population of students. And that's problematic because an insignificant proportion of ninth graders are retained each year. So the denominator of first-time ninth graders in this indicator is estimated by averaging enrollment, the enrollment of eighth graders the preceding year, the enrollment in ninth grade the next year, and the enrollment in 10th grade the year after that. They average those three numbers together to get a kind of estimated ninth grade cohort. And then the numerator is simply the number of reported graduates 4 years later. So the AFGR in 2012-13 was 81.9%. So it's definitely a more accurate indicator of cohorts than you'd get from the status rate, but it still has problems. As I said, it's not a true cohort rate. So the answer to this was the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate, which is the one that Julie used in her report. So this indicator grew out of the U.S. Department of Education mandate that all states comply with a uniform nationwide cohort-based graduation rate metric. So it's technically called the 4-year adjusted cohort rate, and it measures the quote number of students who graduate in 4 years with a regular high school diploma divided by the number of students who form the adjusted cohort for that class, with the adjustment cohort being the students who enter ninth grade, as Julie pointed out in her formula, including ones that transfer in after the beginning of ninth grade and those that transfer out at the end of ninth grade, and they can be removed for if they leave the country or are deceased. So the main advantage of this rate, which is that it's a true cohort rate, in that you're measuring the actual performance of students, the same students over time. But it also has a number of limitations. One of them is it fails to account for the characteristics of students when they walk in the door, measuring how many students earn a diploma in 4 years regardless of how well prepared they are when they start high school, including students who need to learn English, as Julie pointed out. Second of all, they ignore students who graduate in 5 or 6 years, even if these students start high school below grade level and therefore need extra time to finish. So while it may be relevant and valid to look at 4-year or on-time rates for students who start high school who are on track and not behind in grade level in English skills or other kinds of characteristics, it's not necessarily fair for students who don't start high school at grade level. Third, it fails to account for students who change schools. It holds the receiving school fully responsible for the success or failure of a transfer student, no matter how long they attend that school, while absolving the originating school of every responsibility, no matter how long they attend that school. So this provides traditional schools with a perverse incentive to, quote, discharge their most hard-to-educate students in order to bolster their on-time graduation rate. The federal government, as a result of the importance of this indicator, has undertaken a couple of inspections through the Office of the Inspector General of several states to ensure that the graduation rates that they report are accurate and comply with the federal definition. So one of these was undertaken in California last year, and they've been done in some other states as well. So it's illustrative of some of these issues. So the 2018 audit in California found 2 major shortcomings in the calculation of the state's graduation rates. First, the California Department of Education did not find sufficient control over calculating and reporting graduation rates by local authorities to ensure that they are accurate and complete. So, for example, this included documenting that transfer students actually transferred into a program that would award them a regular high school diploma. And second, the state was not calculating its ACGR in accordance with federal requirements, in particular, removing students from the cohort if they transfer to an adult school or community college, and counting graduates who earned their diploma at an adult school. In response, the audit began issuing the state, in response to the audit, started issuing a revised four-year graduation rate beginning in 2016-17 that reduced the reported rate by about 2 percentage points. If you look at that graph, you can see that there's a dip in California's rates due to this adjustment by the federal government. So then let me briefly talk about two other rates that I think could address some of the shortcomings of the four-year ACGR. One of those is the ones that Julie talked about, which is that the ESSA does allow states to calculate and use extended high school graduate rates to establish long-term education goals and to evaluate programs. So as you pointed out, there are a number of states who compute 5- and 6-year graduation rate for accountability purposes. So in doing so, not only raises the overall graduation rates by roughly 2 to 4 percentage points, it shows the greatest improvement for some subgroups, as Julie pointed out, and I would just use the example of Arizona, where the difference between 4- and 5-year graduation rates for all students was about 4.4 percentage points, while the improvement in graduation rates for English learners was over 13 percentage points. So including the 5- and 6-year rates, as Julie points out, really makes a big difference on certain subgroups, in particular English learners being one of those. California, if you look at Table 1 that's there now, California just in a couple of years, 2010, 11, 11, 12, computed 5- and 6-year graduation rates along with 4-year graduation rates. And we did some simulations that I won't go into about how to do it, some other ways of trying to compute these if we didn't have true cohort 5- and 6-year rates. And then I also show some comparisons with the average freshman graduation rate. So this table illustrates the same findings that Julie had in her report, which was really adding these 5- and 6-year rates really makes a difference of improving graduation rates, especially for certain groups like English learners. Another graduation rate that's particularly useful for alternative schools, and those are schools that frequently receive students who first enter traditional comprehensive high schools in 9th grade and then transfer either voluntarily or involuntarily to an alternative setting. Such students are frequently behind on credits and thus unlikely to graduate with their cohort. An alternative way to judge the effectiveness of non-traditional high schools is to compute a 1-year graduation rate, which is the ratio of successful graduates to graduation eligible 12th graders, a rate that's now used in the state of Oregon, for example. So we did a little study of some schools, different kinds of schools using these grade 12 rates, which is in Table 2, if I can get it to work. There it is. Whoops, we skipped it. There we are. So we did a little study of some different kinds of high schools using these different rates. So if you look at the grad 12 rate, you can see that compared with the traditional cohort graduation rate, charter and alternative schools appear to be more effective than their respective average cohort adjusted rates would suggest. For alternative schools, the grade 12 rate averaged 12 percentage points higher than the ACGR over a 3-year period from 2011-12 to 13-14. For charters, the average difference between the reported ACGR for 11-12, 13-14 was just over 16 percentage points. So it provides a better indicator of the performance of alternative schools than an ACGR because many of these schools have students who are not in their cohort, and so they look like they're not performing very well on the traditional indicator. So in conclusion, while seemingly straightforward, computing accurate and useful high school graduation rates is actually quite complicated. And because high school graduation rates serve different purposes, there's no single rate that's sufficient to measure the success of students and schools in graduating students in high school. Thus, while the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate is the official, quote, gold standard in computing graduation rates, it has a number of limitations, including its focus on on-time rates rather than a longer period that better accounts for the situation faced by certain subgroups, such as English learners and students with disabilities, and by non-traditional high schools. Graduation rates should be a central part of a state's accountability system and incentivized to successfully educate all incoming 9th graders. This could be accomplished by making schools responsible for the outcomes of its students even after transferring to an alternative school. Indeed, we argue that graduation rates should not just be ascribed to the last school attended, but rather to all schools that students attend, perhaps based on the amount of time and the number of credits that students spend in each school. So as this brief talk suggests, it's very important that we have accurate and useful high school graduation rate indicators. And again, I don't think any single indicator, including the current federal 4-year adjusted cohort rate, are sufficient to really get a handle and see how not only schools are doing, but students are doing. Thank you very much. And we'll, I guess, take questions now.
Yes, thank you, Russ. That was terrific. I want to encourage folks who are listening. Thanks for those of you who have already sent in questions. You can see there on the screen the email address to send them into, but you can just write in on the webinar platform on the right there your questions, and then you can also tweet them to us. So Russ, I think that what a great note to end on. I think that that the point you were just making about trying to, in a sense, share accountability across schools that students have attended is something that we really don't see any place doing, and it's it's one of those important learnings from seeing how graduation rates have had, or the calculations that are being used wind up having some unintended consequences, and that could be a pretty powerful remedy. I want to I guess tee up a question for Julie now that came over the chat by saying, first of all, that the webinar has been mainly focused on this issue of the 4-year graduation rate. What are some of the unintended consequences? Therefore, looking at how to count 5 or 6 year, but I do want to make sure we really plant the flag around what the purpose of the 4-year graduation rate always was, which was trying to have comparable data across states, because for years it was sort of that, most of the data were unusable, and there was a lot of, it was very, very difficult, and it was a huge concern for civil rights advocates that we really weren't operating off of good data in terms of understanding how students were doing and how to, in a sense, drive federal investments and protect taxpayer dollars, et cetera, and that we at MPI had certainly seen No Child Left Behind as revolutionary in having ELL subgroup accountability, and have seen a lot of the positives that have flowed from that. But then that's very much in tension with everything we're talking about here, where on the one hand, we really want to have a system that pushes schools to be accountable for providing the highest quality services as possible. And I think this whole conversation here is what's the productive tension there. You don't want to tip so much so that it's unfair to schools and the educators working with those students, that it's unrealistic expectations. And on the other hand, it's pretty hard to kind of say, based on what both Julie and Russ have presented here, how do you really get that balance in terms of what's the most productive tension? And so the question was, well, in California, there's a lot of long-term English learners, and you would think that the system really should be held accountable for presumably not providing a very good education to kids who have been in the system for so many years, that they're in high school and they're still English learners. And so, Julie, just that how do we think about what data should be used? What's the giving too much leeway by using a 5-year graduation rate for ELLs, especially if that group were to include folks who had been in the system for so many years?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I get into a little bit in the paper is that there's not enough good data on what I showed in my first slide about the different kinds of ELs. And, we don't really know which of the groups are taking advantage of a 5-year more than others. There's a couple different ways I looked at it, and they had somewhat contradictory findings. So yeah, I think when I went into this, I thought, oh, this is really just about the newcomers, and there wouldn't really be any reason for the long-term ELs to require 5 years. But maybe there's a subset of those kids. Maybe what I've heard is that a lot of long-term English learners are dually identified as special ed. So maybe it's their special ed needs that mean that they should have 5 years. So I'm not arguing for any particular definition at this point. I think we need a lot more data to look at exactly which English learners are using a 5-year rate in a good way, and to really think from a pedagogical research point of view of where does it make sense to have 5 years, where does it make sense to be more flexible, and where does it not? Because I absolutely agree that the students that have been in the system are really, since kindergarten or earlier, are really a different set from the newcomers.
Great. And then Russ, we had a question about the adult high school diploma, and just wondered, I think that was one of the issues you covered in your report from last year. Could you talk a little bit more about, you had mentioned it earlier in your presentation, about needing to compare the requirements for adult high school diploma programs in California to regular high school diploma requirements because of critiques that were raised in the OIG report?
Yes. So we didn't do a comprehensive analysis, but we took a couple of districts. So adult high schools are typically provided either by school districts or, at least in California, community colleges. So depending on the area of the state we're talking about, either community colleges are going to serve that purpose, or regular adult schools run by school districts are going to serve that purpose. But then you want to look at what the requirements are. So most states have some kind of, in fact, I think now all states, what didn't used to be the case, but I think all states now set a state requirement for diploma requirements, and then districts have the chance to typically add additional courses or other requirements to earn a diploma. So, but for example, one of the things that's required at the state level in California is 2 years of physical education. But if you just look at the academic requirements, how many English courses you need and how many math courses you need, at least in our kind of cursory analysis of a couple of school districts, the adult diploma had a similar requirement in terms of academic coursework. So my point would be, if they in fact meet state standards based on the state requirements, why shouldn't that diploma count? So I don't see the argument on why they discount or dismiss diplomas that are earned in adult schools, as long as the adult schools require at least the state level requirements of what a diploma should be. And if the state thinks they should be higher than that, they can raise the state requirements, and the adult schools would have the opportunity to respond to that. So anyway, I don't like the idea that the diploma is that restrictive in terms of, and that's where they put the word preponderance in there, I think. Which is, if most of the state schools require a certain level of requirements in terms of coursework, then that's going to be what the definition is. So anyway, that's the kind of limitation, I think, with adult school diplomas.
Yeah, I think this is going to become maybe a more and more interesting kind of conversation in a number of states. Julie and I were talking before the webinar, since I spend a fair amount of my time now on adult ed issues, and it's a bit of an issue from the sort of first generation immigrant perspective, that now high school equivalency diplomas are supposed to be aligned with college and career ready standards, which, in many ways is a good thing for 1.5 generation kids maybe who had dropped out of school and want to come back. But that is pretty difficult for folks who came as adults and might need to attain those diplomas, because you might be talking, almost 1,500 hours of program time, for folks to try and both learn English and also work their way to a high school equivalency. But, it's hard not to have them be aligned if it really is a high school equivalency. So there's a lot of action, I would say, in the adult ed arena. And then obviously, Russ, what you just plainly stated, like if it meets state standards, why doesn't it count? But Julie, did you want to jump in on that at all? Because there is some research there that probably drove that earlier decision about not counting them.
Yeah, and Russ mentioned that in his talk a little bit too, about how the research has shown that students who, under the previous rules who received a GED had similar lifetime outcomes, basically, to students who dropped out. So it wasn't really acting as a high school equivalency. It was not helping them. Now, of course, we don't know what the other considerations are there. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see, as you say, if the high school equivalency degree is the GED test and the other tests that exist are now aligned to college and career, whether those, we'll have to rethink whether those degrees can be included. And I did want to also follow up that this new issue I mentioned briefly in my report about most of the rules around graduation rates are the same from NCLB to ESSA, and ESSA was, of course, the reauthorization in 2015. But they did tie things down just a little bit more by saying that states could only count the, instead of just saying states could count the degree that meets standards, it's the state can only count the degree awarded to the preponderance of students in the state that meets the state standard. So there are a couple of states that this is going to be an issue for. I know Indiana is one that, you know, they have basically 2 diplomas they offer, and they consider both of them to be meeting state standards. But the one that's we might, in shorthand, say is less rigorous, is given to fewer students, and so Indiana won't be able to necessarily count that. Now, I read one article on that, and I haven't really kept up with the issue, so don't ask me any more questions. But you know, it's an interesting idea that in this last reauthorization, they sort of clamped down even further on making sure that there really was that, you know, the federal government in their regulations, there really is only one kind of definition that counts.
I think that's a limitation. So.
Yeah.
My goodness, so many great questions coming in. So we'll try and get to all of them, and we'll be able to follow up by email with any that we don't get to. So there were a few folks writing in about how their states offer alternative ways to demonstrate competency, and that many students fall back on those alternatives. So, so one in particular from New Mexico says that they allow for alternative demonstration of competency for seniors who cannot pass the PARCC exam, and admission to college is how most of their immigrant students meet the graduation requirements. So, Russ or Julie, do you want to comment on whether your research considers whether states offer alternative ways to demonstrate competency, and how many students fall back on those alternatives that the state provides?
Well, I'll just say that it's not really clear to me at this point when states say they offer alternatives or do different things, whether those systems are sort of parallel with what ESSA requires, which I'm more familiar with in the state level, or whether those things are actually fulfilling ESSA requirements. So I'm looking forward to hearing if Russ has a thought about this, because it is a little bit confusing when ESSA says you can only do such and such, and then states say, well, actually we have all of these different ways of doing accountability, and here's these 4 different ways of looking at things, and it's not quite clear to me exactly how that works out.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are states that have equivalency test requirements or other kinds of requirements, and then ways of meeting those requirements. So it seems to me that there should be a distinction between setting whatever the requirements are and then allowing different ways of meeting those requirements. And as long as those alternative ways of meeting those requirements are demonstrated to be accurate substitutes, let's say, for the traditional ways of meeting those requirements, it should be okay, you know. So, but yeah, it would depend just on each state. You'd have to kind of look at what the data are, and unfortunately, I don't think we have the data to make that determination. But in general, I think we should view high school as clearly an important milestone in education, but also providing different pathways to get there. And so we do have those, alternative schools and online courses and things like that, some of which are, I think, not good or abused, but that doesn't mean that they're inherently bad. And so the degree to which we can promote legitimate alternative pathways to reach those goals, I think that's what we should try to be doing.
Yeah, very interesting. So I want to combine a few questions that came in that are sort of an outgrowth of this. So one of them, a number of folks have written in about how many of the L's that they see at the high school level in different states, and certainly a lot of the folks who are on the phone who work with refugee populations are saying that many of their students have an interrupted education in their home country. And of course, we're seeing a lot more of that again with the new numbers of individuals, asylum seekers coming to the southern border, which relates a little bit to a question, and Julie, you talked about this a little bit before, but what are some of the criteria that could be built into policy so that you wouldn't have all L's automatically shifted over to a 5 or 6 year cohort? How do you figure that out? But wait, it gets even a little more complicated with a question asking, has there been any work interviewing L's by typologies as to why they feel they need more time? Because doesn't the profile of a student matter if they're motivated to continue working to receive their diploma? How do you honor and not diminish when students are motivated? But I guess the question of whether would policymakers and civil rights leaders really want that student to be in a 5 or 6 year cohort, even though anyway, it's this is the really squishy ground.
Absolutely, and I love those two questions paired together because it allows me to differentiate a little bit between what we mean by allowing a 5 or 6 year graduation rate as part of accountability and a 5 year path of instruction. So in terms of accountability, if a state were to say, we give schools credit, which obviously the majority of the states do, we give schools credit if they have students that graduate in 5 years, which means we give them points towards their accountability system based on not just how many kids graduate in 4 years, but how many graduate in 5. And of course, you don't know at the beginning of a student's career how long they're going to necessarily take. If they take 4, that's great. If they take 5, they get credit for that too. So there's sort of that question of the system. When the system allows for 5 or 6 year graduation rates, that just sort of provides the flexibility that if students take that path, that it's given credit. Then the other issue that I was getting at was this issue of having a 5 year path of instruction. I think a lot of newcomer programs, when they have been set up over the last 10, 20 years, said, well, let's start with some English language development and for a semester or a year, however long the student needs. But those classes don't generally get credit. So if you're taking non-credit courses as a high school student, that means that you are sort of by definition going to be on a longer path just because it'll take you longer to get to the finish line. But that's got to be determined based on the student need. If a student the issue is that a student coming in who really needs extra time, who really needs 5 years because they don't have very much education, there should not be anything in the accountability system that influences the decision as to what the path for that student should be. If they need 5 years and they're going to be successful after 5 years, that's fantastic and that's what they should have. If a student comes in and they've been in the system all this time, we can make a policy decision that this is not going to apply to long-term English learners. We really need more data on what's going on with these different groups of students. We really haven't even tracked those things on a large scale. So it's been very hard to get that data. So I think I would certainly not be ready to say, other than the students with interrupted formal education, which I think is probably pretty clear that they could benefit from extra time, I'm not ready to sort of declare which other groups would be best put in a assumed 5-year cohort or not. We really just need more information about, how these students are doing and what the incentives would be. We don't want to let high schools off the hook for those long-term English learners that they need to be doing, and the whole system needs to be doing a better job with. So these are really some open questions. It's squishy, as Margie says.
So Russ, I'm sure you may want to jump in on what Julie just said, but if you don't mind me complicating it a little bit, and for folks who are on the line, I think we'll only go for like 5 minutes more. But we had a question about AB 2021 being enacted in California last fall, and I thought, I'm not sure it's a fair question for you if you were following that legislation closely, but it had to do with pupil instruction, with coursework and graduation requirements, including those for migratory children and newly arrived immigrant pupils. So the question was simply, what do we anticipate happening now that that's been enacted in California? But then there was also a question of saying, and I think this is a bit what the California legislation was attempting to respond to. What's the thinking on students who enter high schools whose age, LEP status, and lack of credits make it mathematically impossible for them to graduate prior to aging out?
Well, so I'll plead ignorance to the first thing about the bill. I'm not familiar with the legislation, so I can't comment. I can't comment about that. Well, I think that students should be encouraged and supported to finish high school no matter how old they are, frankly. So, I mean, that's where adult schools do come in, right? Because they're, maybe districts don't want to educate older students, even though I think they probably should, but especially because most districts do have an adult ed program, it seems like they could get them in there. Let me just, I know we've got to wrap up, so I'll just make one comment about this whole issue about extended rates, which is I make this comparison with what happens in college, which many people are probably familiar with, but universities compute graduation rates too, and they compute 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rates for 4-year colleges, even though most degree programs are designed to be completed in 4 years. A very high percentage of students do not finish their undergraduate diplomas in 4 years. They take 5 or 6 years. So the system calculates 4-, 5-, and 6-year rates. And in fact, the 6-year rate is the kind of default rate that's reported, for example, by the NCAA on student athlete success and graduation. They don't even worry about 4- and 5-year rates. So I think we're kind of overly fixated on it because the federal government has chosen this one single indicator, when in fact we should be supporting and applauding any student in any school that gets their high school diploma, no matter how long it takes. That should be the mindset in my mind. And we do that already in higher education, but we don't seem to do that in a secondary education or high school education, but I think we should. So I think we should take a page from the playbook of colleges and say, let's everybody compute 4-, 5-, and 6-year rates. And as long as you finish in 6 years, even if it takes you 6 years to finish, go to it. And we should be supporting and applauding those efforts.
Well, I would love to find a way to continue the conversation, including with a lot of the folks who are on the line, because it's an interesting mix of civil rights advocates, including folks who were part of a lawsuit in Ohio, where a lot of late arriving students were automatically being placed in 7th grade in order to avoid the cohort rate and/or in high school without being enrolled in any core academic courses. So I just would say that from that we've still got the lingering civil rights issue of how to make sure that schools really have motivation, I guess, in a sense, to serve students as well as they possibly can, and to meet students' needs. And what do we do when those needs are very broad for students? So I just can't thank you enough, Russ Rumberger, for joining us for this conversation. Julie, congratulations on the report release, and for everyone online, we'll have a conversation here about what do we do with all the issues we've opened up here, because they're actively under consideration in a number of states that have very large number of L's, and we'd really like to figure out how to meet the kind of the information and analytic needs of folks who want to be involved in those conversations. So thanks again to our speakers and to everyone who's joined us, and we look forward to finding a way to stay in touch around these issues. There's our contact information, and thanks for all the work all of you are doing, and we look forward to crossing paths again soon. Bye-bye.